Somewhere in a quiet military cemetery in northern Germany, under a headstone most people will never visit, lies a man whose actions saved as many as 200,000 lives in less than a week. Yet if you watch the film that turned his story into a global phenomenon, you will never once hear his real name. He was written out of his own rescue. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that omission still haunts his family today, and what it reveals about how Hollywood quietly reshapes history while convincing us we've seen the truth. Before we get to him, though, there's a lot you need to know about Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan's 2017 masterpiece, and just how far the line between fact and fiction actually stretches in it. If stories like this pull you in, this channel exists entirely to dig underneath the films you think you already know. So if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and drop a comment telling me which movie's true story you want investigated next, because I read every single one. Let's start with the myth. Most people walk away from this film believing without question that a spontaneous armada of civilian sailors in their little fishing boats and pleasure yachts single-handedly turned the tide and rescued the British Army from annihilation. The film builds toward this moment as its emotional climax, hundreds of small vessels appearing on the horizon like a miracle. It's one of the most powerful sequences in modern war cinema. It is also, in the strictest sense, not quite how it happened. The overwhelming majority of the roughly 338,000 men evacuated during Operation Dynamo, more than 260,000 of them, were pulled directly off the harbor's stone breakwaters and onto large naval destroyers and merchant ships, not off the open beaches by fishing boats. Historians estimate that the celebrated little ships, the vessels immortalized in the film's final act, were directly responsible for ferrying somewhere around 15,000 men back across the channel themselves, though they played a far larger supporting role shuttling stranded soldiers from the shallow surf out to the larger ships waiting offshore. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. The first civilian boat didn't even arrive until May 29th. A full 3 days after the evacuation had already begun. The miracle was real. The way we've been told it happened is, in large part, a simplified legend. So if the boats weren't quite the full story, who was actually running this operation? This is where the film starts inventing people out of thin air, and where things get genuinely strange. Almost every character with a name in Dunkirk is fictional. Tommy, the young soldier at the center of the story, Gibson, Alex, the Spitfire pilot farrier, none of them existed. That's a deliberate storytelling choice, meant to represent the anonymous mass of ordinary men caught in an extraordinary event, and it works beautifully as cinema. But two characters in the film are loosely built from real people, and the way Nolan chose to build them tells you something important about what gets remembered and what gets erased. Kenneth Branagh plays Commander Bolton, the officer overseeing the evacuation from the harbor's stone pier, calm under fire, watching the horizon for salvation. Bolton is described as a composite character, and that word is doing a lot of quiet work, because it blends together the real contributions of several actual officers. Most notably, Captain Bill Tennant, the senior naval officer who ran Operation Dynamo, and a Canadian officer named James Campbell Clouston, who was actually the one physically stationed on the mole itself, directing the flow of men onto ships for days without rest. We'll come back to him, because his real story is far more remarkable than anything in the finished film, and far more tragic. The other, partially real character is easier to spot, and far more openly celebrated. Mark Rylance plays Mr. Dawson, the civilian sailor who takes his own small boat, the Moonstone, across the channel to help with the rescue. Dawson was inspired by a real man named Charles Lightoller, If that name sounds familiar, it should, because Lightoller wasn't just any sailor. He was the most senior surviving officer of the Titanic, the man who spent that freezing April night in 1912 loading lifeboats and eventually surviving by climbing onto an overturned collapsible raft as the ship went down beneath him. 28 years later, in his 60s, Lightoller took his own personal yacht, the Sundowner, across the channel to Dunkirk and helped rescue soldiers off the French coast. A man who survived one of history's most infamous maritime disasters spent his later years running directly toward another one, voluntarily, to save strangers. That's not a detail Hollywood needed to invent. It was simply too good and too true to leave out. Now, here's something the film gets almost entirely backwards, and it involves the weather. In Dunkirk, the sea is angry. Wind whips the beach, waves crash against overturned hulls, and the ocean itself feels like another enemy the soldiers have to survive. In reality, the channel during the actual evacuation was almost unnervingly calm, glassy, and still for most of the operation. That calm sea wasn't incidental either. It was one of the critical, almost providential factors that made the entire evacuation possible in the first place, allowing small flat-bottomed civilian boats to operate close to shore without being swamped. Nolan has explained that he deliberately chose to film in rougher conditions because he wanted audiences to viscerally feel just how fragile and exposed those small pleasure boats really were out on open water. A danger that the calm, real-world footage of 1940 simply wouldn't have communicated on screen. It's a defensible artistic choice. It's also the exact opposite of what actually happened that week. The city itself tells a similar story of selective truth. In the film's aerial shots, Dunkirk still looks recognizably like a town, streets and buildings largely intact beneath the smoke. By the time of the real evacuation, the city had already been pounded into rubble by relentless Luftwaffe bombing raids, block after block reduced to ruin. Production actually had to shoot the urban sequences in the neighboring town of Malo-les-Bains, because Dunkirk's real historical center simply couldn't visually double for its own past. And then there's a silence in the film that historians and descendants alike have pointed to for years, one that goes beyond simple dramatic license. The soldiers we see on those beaches are overwhelmingly white, British and French. But the real Operation Dynamo included substantial numbers of colonial and Commonwealth troops, including soldiers from British India. Hundreds of unarmed muleteers from the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, part of what was known as Force K6, were present on those same beaches, tending their mules under the same bombs. Their presence, and their absence from the finished film, has become part of a broader conversation about which parts of a global empire's war get remembered on screen, and which, quietly, vanish. The French, too, get a complicated portrayal. Early in the operation, some British commanders did initially resist evacuating French troops in equal numbers alongside their own men, a policy that was reversed only after direct pressure from Winston Churchill, who insisted the evacuation be shared equally between the Allies. What the film barely gestures at is the staggering cost the French army paid to make the entire evacuation possible in the first place. French forces fought a desperate, bloody holding action at Lille and around the shrinking Dunkirk perimeter, buying time with their own lives so the encircled armies behind them could escape. By the operation's end, roughly 120,000 French soldiers had been evacuated as well. But many more never made it off the beaches at all. Even the small technical details carry hidden stories. Watch the German fighters in the film closely, and you'll notice their noses are painted bright yellow, a deliberate choice so audiences could instantly tell friend from foe against the British Spitfires. Historically accurate, not for this battle. That yellow nose paint scheme wasn't actually applied to German aircraft until after the Dunkirk evacuation had already ended. The propaganda leaflets German planes dropped over the retreating soldiers appear in vivid color on screen. The real ones, dropped in 1940, were printed strictly in black and white. Even the dogfights overhead were staged and filmed at altitudes considerably lower than real Tu aerial combat, a choice made for visual drama and practical filming constraints rather than accuracy. Sharp-eyed veterans even caught a small procedural error, an officer saluting without wearing his beret, a detail that would have been considered improper military protocol at the time. What's remarkable is how much of the film's power came from refusing shortcuts elsewhere. Nolan famously built this movie around almost no computer-generated imagery at all, an almost unheard-of decision for a war epic of this scale. He shot on IMAX and 65mm film, and instead of digital armies, production used roughly 1,500 real extras alongside cardboard cutouts to fill out the beach crowds. For the sea sequences, the production didn't build models. It towed an actual decommissioned French destroyer, the Maille-Brisée, out into open water off the French coast to film a torpedo strike, before finishing the sinking sequence on a massive hydraulic gimbal built on a studio backlot, and completing the flooded interior shots in a tank on a soundstage in Burbank. At the height of production, as many as 62 real ships were operating on the water in a single day of filming. For the aerial combat, visual effects supervisor Andrew Jackson combined footage of genuine restored Spitfires with large-scale remote-control miniature aircraft, some with wingspans stretching up to 6 meters, piloted from planes flying alongside them because the operating range from the ground simply wasn't enough. It's one of the strange ironies of this film, a story told with real, deliberate historical distortions, built almost entirely out of real, physical, practical things. Which brings us back to the man in that quiet German cemetery. His name was James Campbell Clouston, a Canadian-born Royal Navy officer, and if Bolton in the film is a composite character, Clouston is arguably the person whose real actions the role owes the most to and credits the least. When the naval shore party arrived at Dunkirk to organize the evacuation, 3 officers literally cut cards to divide up responsibilities. Clouston drew the eastern mole, a narrow wooden walkway on a concrete breakwater, never designed to load ships, but the only part of the harbor the Luftwaffe hadn't already reduced to rubble. For 6 days, standing exposed under repeated bombing and strafing runs, megaphone in hand, Clouston personally organized and regulated the flow of tens of thousands of men onto the waiting ships, timing the human tide against the arrival of each vessel with almost mechanical precision. Historians estimate the majority of the men saved during the entire operation passed through the mole under his direct command. The author, John Masefield, later wrote that Clouston had been of the utmost service in helping the escape of nearly 200,000 men under frightful conditions of strain and danger. On June 2nd, after briefly returning to England, Clouston insisted on going back to Dunkirk to help coordinate the rescue of the remaining French and Belgian troops still trapped in the perimeter. His motor launch was spotted and attacked by German aircraft in the Channel. Clouston and his crew survived the initial strike, thrown into the water, alive in their life jackets, and, according to accounts of his final hours, they were left stranded at sea, slowly succumbing to exposure, with no rescue reaching them in time. He was 39 years old. He never saw the operation he had organized reach its final day. And yet, in the film that made this story a household name for a new generation, Clouston does not exist. His role was folded, unnamed and uncredited, into the fictional Commander Bolton, played by a blonde, British-coated Kenneth Branagh. Members of Clouston's own family have spoken publicly about their disappointment that a Canadian officer's specific sacrifice was smoothed away into a composite character with no connection to his name or his nationality. It wasn't until years after the film's release, through renewed historical interest it helped spark, that Clouston finally received a formal commemoration in Canada as a hometown hero at the historic site near where he was born. The film that reawakened the world's fascination with Dunkirk never once said the name of James Campbell Clouston. But now you know his name, and you know his story. If you believe heroes like James Campbell Clouston deserve to be remembered, please hit the like button so this video can reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten history behind your favorite movies, and leave a comment below. Did Nolan make the right choice by using a composite character, or should Clouston's name have been on that screen? Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.